here to talk a little bit about the state legislative perspective on all of this. And I think as a threshold matter and as a point of departure, it was said earlier that your industry and what's going on is being done in direct contravention of federal law. I mean, and it makes for a really unique public policy discussion about states essentially enacting laws that nullify a federal law, and I can't really recall another instance of that happening in U.S. history. The most prominent example would be back before the Civil War when the fugitive slave laws, when you had certain states refusing to acknowledge that federal law because it was in contravention of what they believed was morally just and right. And I think to a similar extent, you have that same phenomenon working here. You've got the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which was really a politically driven piece of legislation. President Nixon protested the Vietnam War. It wasn't based on good science, and yet it's formed generations of cultural attitudes toward cannabis. And what you've seen in the interim are these medical breakthroughs. We've seen researchers in the American Academy of Sciences recently stating that there is conclusive proof that there's medicinal qualities to cannabis, which are in direct contravention to it being scheduled as a Schedule I drug at the federal level. So state legislators' response to this is within that context, within the context of a federal law that quite frankly doesn't have any sound basis to it. But by and large, state legislators are herd animals, right? They want to feel safe. They want to feel like they're not taking a position that's going to cause them to lose re-election. And so, you know, when I authored and sponsored and got passed South Carolina's first cannabis law back in 2014, we really snuck up on law enforcement and got it done before they could respond. And it's a fairly narrow law. CBD, as you know, doesn't have the psychoactive components to it. It was limited to patients with intractable epilepsy. So we really got that thing through without having a heavy lift. But since then, I filed a comprehensive medical cannabis law that's been pending for a couple of years. And law enforcement has come out, really hard against it and spending a lot of their political capital in opposition to it. And so I want to share with you maybe the 5 or 6 things that I've been doing to try to get no votes to yeses within that context. And the first thing, you begin with personal stories. It's been my experience that all the legal arguments you want to make, all the medical science you want to cite, pales in comparison to showing a legislator how a family in their district is having to cope with not having the medicine that their child, that their family member needs. And so what I started to do, beginning Senate sessions every morning for 5 minutes, was telling, because you're allowed a 5-minute point of personal interest on the Senate floor, and taking advantage of that and telling every day for 5 minutes the story of a family who is suffering in South Carolina, whose child either has epilepsy or MS, or cerebral palsy, or any number of things. And then afterwards, taking the legislator who represents that family upstairs to meet that family. Nothing takes the place of that. Nothing takes the place of those personal stories. The second thing is to emphasize the science, to talk about the American Academy of Sciences and all the peer-reviewed studies and the conclusive evidence that it has medicinal qualities, and making that case as well. But then what I also have to do to make them safe, and I agree a lot with what Aaron said about the Cole Memorandum and the federal budget proviso, as a practical matter may not make a lot of difference to your industry on the ground, but it makes a difference to legislators. And in terms of making legislators comfortable, what has been helpful to me is pointing to the Cole Memorandum, is pointing out that there's been an instruction by the Attorney General's office to U.S. attorneys throughout the country not to enforce the Schedule I federal prohibition in states where there have been medical cannabis laws. That's been very persuasive in helping legislators feel comfortable. Also talking with legislators about the United States versus Prince decision, which sets forth the anti-commandeering doctrine, which says that states cannot be compelled to spend state resources to enforce a federal mandate or a federal law. And again, that particular U.S. Supreme Court decision gives comfort to those legislators who are being asked to take a position that's in contravention to federal law. The budget provisos, again, it may not have an effect in practice, but it does have a substantial effect in trying to persuade a conservative or a social conservative legislator to support your medical cannabis law. If you can point to the proviso or the amendment in the budget which forbids the DOJ from using any appropriated money to enforce those Schedule I prohibitions, that takes you a long way from giving them comfort for passing a law in contravention of the CSA. So again, in practice, it probably doesn't make much of a difference, but in terms of persuading, in terms of pushing back against individuals who say, we don't want to go against what federal law says, both the budget proviso and the Cole memorandum are very powerful tools that you can use in that regard. It's also very comforting to point out about the 10th Amendment and the powers reserved to the states, and how 29 other states in the District of Columbia have gone ahead on the strength of those powers reserved in the 10th Amendment, acted. I mean, so that's a way of making legislators feel safe as well. They're not being pioneers here, right? I mean, we've got 29 states, and you've got the District of Columbia that have already done this. And then what you do is you go ahead and you talk about public opinion polling. In South Carolina, 78% of Republicans believe that cannabis ought to be authorized for medicinal use. 80% of Democrats. And as Aaron said, I can't think of any other issue out there that enjoys that kind of supermajority support. And what I've started to do in talking to some of these legislators who aren't, very eager to get on board my bill, I take an aggressive approach and say, look, 4 or 5 years from now, this is going to hurt you. 4 or 5 years from now, you're going to have to explain to families in your district why you decided law enforcement and politicians were going to be the ones that decided what medicine people get instead of doctors. And so you may feel safe right now. You may feel as if you're taking a position that reassures your reelection. But I'm telling you, those families in South Carolina are paying attention to how you're handling this issue and how you're voting on this issue. And what you perceive now as being something that is safe is going to be turned around and used against you in a short amount of time. Because the fact of the matter is this: there can only be a disconnect between government laws and what the people want for so long. At some point in time, laws are going to conform with what people demand. And people clearly, you guys out here are evidence of the fact that people are demanding cannabis be available as medicine. And at this point in time, you're seeing the death rattle, I think, of federal prohibition. And I share Aaron's point. I mean, I think the fact that the repeal of the Cole memorandum and perhaps the difficulty of that budget proviso passing in the short term makes things more difficult for someone like me who's trying to persuade state legislators and giving them some comfort. In the long run, I think actually counterintuitively, it's a positive thing. It is forcing Congress now to look at that Controlled Substances Act and realize that it's not based on science. President Nixon's own Medical Advisory Council advised against it. The American Medical Association back in 1970 advised against it. There is no rational basis for this law. And in some ways, the Cole Memorandum and these budget provisos have given congressmen and senators an out. It's allowed them to duck the issue. So I do think in the long term, this is going, what Jeff Sessions has done, it doesn't seem like it, but it's really a gift. It really is going to accelerate undermining and repealing this CSA law in 1970 that is holding everything back. So I think, in 5 years' time, I honestly think we are going to have some uniform standards. We are going to have FDA approval. We are going to have a lot of these. Right now, it's fascinating to me how the marketplace will step in and provide for its own due diligence standards, its own best practices. It will adapt out there in the absence of government guidance. And it really is instructive to policymakers that at the end of the day, the laws that we pass are truly reflective in many instances of what's actually happening as a reality out there in the real world. And you can't have that disconnect exist for long. So the things that I focus on right now in terms of short-term goals, the repeal of the Cole Memorandum, the difficulty to get the budget proviso passed may hurt, but in the long run, it's going to make your industry It's going to remove that primary impediment, that 1970 law. The struggle that I have as a legislator, and in trying to move a bill forward, especially in the light of hard law enforcement opposition, is do I make concessions? Do I narrow the universe of conditions for which cannabis can be authorized? Do I restrict the mediums through which cannabis can be consumed? There's some sort of an optical aversion that law enforcement has to leaf and burning it. I mean, it's just like Pavlovian. They can't stand it. And so the question is, do I narrow the universe of those conditions? Do I say we're only going to allow for oils? Do I allow law enforcement to have more of a role in what essentially is a public health process? And so that's something that I struggle with. And some days I think that no, I'm going to hold out because I know I'm in the right. And on other days, I want to move the ball forward and I want to get a regulatory apparatus in place because I know at some point in time the federal law is going to change and I want South Carolina to go ahead and have that infrastructure in place. So I'm grappling with that. I think a lot of legislators in southern states or states that are socially conservative are also struggling with this issue. But the good news is this. You guys are evidence of the fact that this is something that the public gets, the public understands, and the public wants to have happen. And, you know, whether or not it takes a year or 5 years, there's going to be a syncing up with the laws to what people want. So that's the good news. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye because I have a flight to Washington, D.C. that leaves very shortly to testify against offshore drilling, and I don't want to miss that. But I did not want to miss this because what you guys are doing, you guys are the tip of the spear here. I mean, you guys are revolutionizing a brand new way of looking at medicine, a brand new way of looking at something for right now that a lot of opiates are being used for. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming in terms of what the benefits of cannabis are. So I applaud you for what you're doing. I appreciate the opportunity to come up here and share very briefly with you my perspective as a state legislator. And in 5 years' time, if I come to this conference, we'll be talking about something much broader and much more fulfilling. Thank you all very much.